My dear friends, it might seem curious that this genealogy has been maintained right through the reform of the liturgy, and yet it need not puzzle us. It is there from bygone days, and there is a reason for it. It collocates Christ's humanity in a context and underlines the true and veritable nature of the Incarnation. The Son of God chose, and indeed himself prepared, a terrain, the only fertile terrain, the people in which there had been a divine pedagogy taking place, monotheism, one God. The revelation up till then was complete insofar as it was the revelation given to that point. And therefore, the Lord himself was his own precursor, through prophets, through the Holy Spirit sent to teach. And he himself was therefore taking on board what? A culture. Now, I want to attack this question of our insertion into a culture. It regards each one of us. We are born in a time and a place. We are born with our own modalities. We are born not on the moon, but here or there on earth, with all that goes with it. As I was preparing for this homily, I happened to pass a large volume which I have in my tiny library. It was a book which has influenced culture and still does, and still will until the end of time. The complete works of Shakespeare, a large volume, and it can be used actually even as a spiritual document in some cases, because the words there are so pithy and so dense in wisdom that they bear reflection and meditation. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. But I brought with me not that, but a smaller one. You know that John Keats had a very short innings, but had he lived, he would have been as great probably as Shakespeare himself. He was a medical student and was at one point nursing his brother, who had tuberculosis. He knew how to do it because he had training in the medical sphere. One day he noticed that he himself was coughing blood, and he knew what that meant. And he wrote this, remembering that he was a brilliant, brilliant man with just his work starting here on earth. He had already stopped his medical studies so as to dedicate himself precisely to culture, to produce beauty everlasting. And he was there realizing what was ahead. His days were numbered. And he wrote this, "When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleamed my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened brain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of high romance," Fanny Brown, he wanted to marry, "and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink." And not long after that, he'd gone into nothingness, and yet lives on a fine young man, a brain teeming, all yet to give, but truncated. And one day in Rome, I was passing by the place where his body is, because he tried to save his life through the heat of Rome. And as I was there, a few meters, I suppose, from where the remains of this and also Shelley were, the Protestant graveyard of Rome, it hit me what we are doing while on earth. What trace shall we leave? What influence shall we have? And I wrote back to him to leave a word that will be heard a while when we have ceased to be beyond the shore of this wide world, and yet beguile the thieving death moth and the eerie wand. They're all expressions of his, answering him back with his own words. That struck ere pen had gleaned the teeming brain. To stand very still where stillness stands against the rush of passing. And again be heard without a voice, but only hands. This is to halt a second in its course and bid it hold an aeon. And on I went, because I realized that he will not cease to be. His hand is still writing in people's minds and memories, as Shakespeare too is calling from the depths of the beyond. His word lives on. Nearer to us, I am quite convinced that our friends the Beatles in the early period will still be sung and appreciated until the end of British time. Whereas today, I wonder a lot whether tomorrow will recognize a similar genius in the pressing of buttons in the so-called music of today. Question mark. Are we demolishing culture, or are we increasing the value of human life? Look too at television. Can you appreciate what is on RTE? And if you can't, why do you let it be? Why give it a voice? It's a test also of interiority, our appreciation of culture. Don't settle for the cheap. Don't settle for the cheap when it comes to God. He is the best and deserves the best. And there have been great geniuses all along the centuries who have given the very best of humanity to God. And in a few years, we have wanted the quickie, the easy, the jazzy, and if possible, nothing at all, because we have other more important things to do. That is how we've crashed down in only a few years. It's all culture, but in that case directly linked to the sacred, because we give of our best from what we have and give it back to God. The whole meaning of the offertory procession. Now, I wanted to attack one thing directly. Look further afield. Appreciate and revere the culture of all. Just this morning, it hit me for 6. Do you know that the famous sounds from hell, which were picked up in the 80s in the equipment of the Soviet Union, and they went beyond the point where land is as it is, because it started to turn very, very quickly after getting through the deepest part it ever drilled into. And therefore they were in a void, going beyond the crust of the earth. And it started to spin so quickly because there was no more resistance. And they put down a modern sensory system to hear what was to be heard down there. And because of the tremendous heat that they had just struck, it melted the sensory system after 30 seconds. But it was recorded. And the person directing the boring operation gave testimony. It's been much disputed whether it's authentic or not, but I don't think the last word has been said. People have been wanting to belittle it, but I'm not quite so sure whether it's simple. I think there may be actually truth in that story, because it's not in the interest of the communists to want to testify to that at all. But what has happened is there's been a lot of talk about it on internet, because it's concerning all of human life and experience. When you get communists talking about that kind of thing, it makes one reflect. And there has been a lot of toing and froing on YouTube and so on about this issue. Now, I happened to come across one particularly interesting YouTube on it, and it was from a very different culture. Do you see what I'm getting at? This person was a Muslim. He picked up this and looked at it very carefully and listened to the whole recording of 30 seconds. And he came out with this. Could be heard about halfway through, and later on also a little bit later, but at a certain point it's quite distinct. He can hear something which to him and to Muslims, pious Muslims, meant a lot more than to us. It was this. He could hear a devil repeating this. Cough, stand up. Now that's Arabic. It's linked with the Hebrew kum, which you actually get in the Gospel, Talitha kum, little girl, get up. Yeah. Now, cough would be the Arabic of it, so the same roots always in Arabic and Hebrew. And the immediate translation, which the devil himself seems to be saying, stand up. And he was saying it, a ghastly command, torturing this person. Cough, stand up. Now, that, for a Muslim, meant something far more, because it's going straight to the Quran. And it's a passage, it's a sutra, which actually is what Muhammad is prophesying. That the oppressors and their wives who have worshipped Allah, that is, they've been performing on the outside their faith, but oppressing, that is, horrible people, they are to be made to stand up, and on it goes, to carry them to their judgment. Now, it was quite clear, and he's put together the video in such a way that he's got at the point where it's coming, and coming again, this word, and in the Arabic and the English following straight away, because the two languages are there. And it's actually just objective fact. We make of it what we want, but it's actually very, very interesting stuff. Because do you see what's going on there? The Lord is present in all these cultures, and he's getting to people in the terms that they know. I know all about it from having been, in my early years, a Welsh Baptist. The Lord is very present in goodwill out there, and one sanctifies oneself to the grace coming to one. But it's probably the same further afield. There's something going on there in souls of goodwill like this, who've known nothing else, who, remember, are trying their best to scramble to salvation with the means that they have. That's what it's all about. We have the advantage of the fullness. And if we leave that fullness and go into a bypass operation, we're in trouble. But they've only known that. So all movement towards the centre is good movement. It's movement away from the centre to get into some sect or whatever, which is dangerous. Dangerous to salvation itself. What am I saying? I'm saying this. When one listens to some kind of testimony of this kind, and there are others similar to it, a lot of them actually on YouTube right now, people who have gone into the beyond and come back, and they all come up in the same sector of YouTube, one after the other. There's a certain common denominator in them all. Once the soul starts travelling, it's very serious stuff indeed. It's alone with its baggage, and there's no return. Now, do you see, at that point, what really matters is this, the fidelity of that soul to the values that it had within its culture. It's on that it's examined and judged. We can't judge another, but we can be careful that we don't fiddle around with what we've got, because if we have the maximum, we're in big trouble if we abuse it. Which leads me to my last point. We have the maximum, and yet we compare ourselves with the way that both within the Christian family other Christians, and further afield, some Hebrews, some Arabs, are very faithful indeed to what they have, we should be ashamed. Just the other day, Father Michael Marr, who is linked with this group because he's the director of the Married Movement of Priests throughout Ireland, appeared, beard and all, at the door, and we had a cenacle together. He often appears just out of the blue, good company and holy company. Now he was coming out with a few interesting things, as he always does. And he was very much aware of the attack that's going on the sacred. Remember that this was precisely what Our Lady was giving to this movement through Father Gobi, that there is an attack on the Mass itself. Therefore, I am asking you, every time we celebrate these sacred mysteries together, to be aware of the backdrop of why we're here. We're here not just for a good evening, we're here on the front line of battle, making up for what is extremely aggravating to the Sacred Heart. And he gave me, in that conversation the other day, an unexpected testimony. It is the story of what happened in the raising up of a great spiritual family to counterbalance the abuse of the Blessed Sacrament. Do you know that the founder of the Blessed Sacrament Fathers was a Marist, like Father Michael Marr? He was very devoted to the Blessed Sacrament and gravitated towards it like a magnet. He spent hours before it, and in those hours a nudge came, stronger and stronger, that there should be a specialization within the Marist family for just that. So that was his plan. But of course it was ostracized and pushed to one side more and more. However, that had been his desire. Eventually he had to get in touch with the Archbishop of Paris to see what could be done about it. But by then, wind had got to the Archbishop of Paris about this foundation to be made, and he would have been against it, because he was in favour of things which would be apostolic. Now, what happened was this. The man was in the Archbishop's palace, and he would have been kept waiting, had it not been for the fact that just by chance, the Archbishop was seeing a very important person out at the door, because he was an important person. They had to be accompanied by the Archbishop to the door, and there he bumped into this young priest. Now, he started to say straight away, "Oh yes, well, I've heard about this desire, and well, of course, what we want is apostolic, so we don't want things of that nature at all." So, at that point, "Oh no!" he explained exactly what the intuition was, that it was to be both and so the Archbishop pricked up his ears and listened. "I say, you're open to preaching." So, just in a few seconds, the almighty Amen came from the Archbishop of Paris, and the thing was split from the Marists and became a new congregation which went all over the world, and it's actually an important part of Ireland. It's in Dublin, as you know, adoration going on and confessions all the time. It's also bang in the middle of Rome, where this saint is buried. And do you know that when he was on his sick bed, he had to have a room which had an open window on the tabernacle. And if you go into the church which he founded, St. Sylvester there in Rome, the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance is enthroned in great glory, very majestic way. And his body is close to it, body of this founder who loved the body of Christ. But you get a feeling in that church what had been given to this founder. The Blessed Sacrament is the maximum, and to honour this in the most maximal way is the best that we can do of our existence. And he had this intuition that it should be a congregation just praising, adoring, and making others do that throughout the world. And he had things to say, such as this. In the Mass, God is immolated, and when God immolates himself, the kings too place themselves on the pavement. He would say that if we had an inkling of what the Blessed Sacrament was, we would creep to it and we would not dare to look at it. That kind of thing would be flowing from his pen all the time. If we knew how many angels were around, we would be terrified. He just knew the invisible. as did closer to us again Padre Pio. If the men on earth knew and understood the value of the Holy Mass, at each Mass there would be a need for policemen to keep order in the crowds of people in the churches. And he knew that every celebration of the Eucharist there was a heap of souls coming from purgatory looking for help and tugging at his chasuble, so to speak. Help us, help us. He could see them and know them. And we, my friends, we don't even bother to make preparation. I just want to finish. You know that some years ago, our present Holy Father went to Valencia in Spain and got hold of the chalice, which is thought, we're not quite sure, but it's one of the ones anyway, which is, for historic reasons, thought to be, it's actually encased in there. We see the shell of it, but the original is said to be in there from the early church. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But what is true, definitely, is that the chalice of the early church was, for a while, that used in the Last Supper. And we have proof of it, which is actually back now in the English translation of the Old Roman Canon. We'd lost it for 40 years, but now they've put back the correct version, that is the translation of the Latin as we have it. It's Hunc Praecarum Caricem, taking this most excellent chalice. That goes back to the early church. It's actually an echo of the Vulgate of, well, an earlier version of the Vulgate, probably the Vetus Latina, of the Psalm 22 or 23. That's another exegetical thing I'm not going into now, but it's an echo of that, and it's actually something which indicates that those celebrating in the early years were using that very chalice, Hunc, this very chalice. So you listen carefully. We'll use the Eucharistic prayer now in English, but it's there. So what am I saying? Here we have a link with the same power that the Lord gave to mankind. The Lord in the Last Supper was giving all his divine power to the church that he was founding in the upper room. He gave the orders, he gave conferred orders, he gave power to forgive sins and power to transmit those orders, and in giving the orders he was giving the power to consecrate. This is what we have even here in this small room. It's as though Christ were again in the upper room saying these words. Now remember that, my friends, because unfortunately the nature of our celebrations in Ireland do not favour interiority. The speed does not favour entering into the mystery. We need time to take in, we need time to perceive the echo, and we need time also to prepare. Hence, and I finish with this, the whole mystique of Advent. There's no point in celebrating Christmas during Advent. It's all topsy-turvy. Advent is a thirst. Advent is an emptiness. Advent also is a simplicity. If we're doing all of Advent concentrating on the perfection of the preparation on the outside, we're missing the grace of Christmas. And let's fall into that pit, because one gets the feeling, my friends, that the only one not feasted at Christmas is Christ the Lord.